Before I start this video, please subscribe to our channel. Story 1. I moved into one of the 4 houses that came from Stephenson Island in the late 1800s. A lot of loggers had died on that island. I was supposed to get the basement for my room, but as soon as I stepped into that house, an eerie presence hit me. I felt uneasy, and the feeling grew worse as I descended into the basement. The crawl space was boarded off. I was a very depressed teenager, debating ending it all. What I didn't know was that something was feeding off that. My room at night had an eerie feeling. I kept the lights completely off and immediately went to sleep because you would see figures of people standing over you, watching you intently. At the time, I believed they were merely curious about my family's presence in the house, wondering what we were doing there. Weird occurrences started happening. I lost my sketchbook, which was like my baby, and I would never lose it. I also had shavers thrown at me in the shower. One time, my brother and I were sitting on the couch playing video games when we heard metal scraping across the attic floor above us. I knew that sound. It was a metal chair scraping across a wooden floor. I told my brother, but he didn't want to believe it. After some time, I finally found my sketchbook in the weirdest place. I was always in my room because my depression was eating me alive, and I would never place my sketchbook so perfectly in front of the door. When I came home and opened my door, there it was, perfectly in the middle. I felt weird, but shrugged it off. Later, my brother left his bowl of mac and cheese in the kitchen, and when he came back, he saw it moving toward the edge of the counter. He doesn't believe in this kind of stuff, but even he couldn't explain that. I started becoming more positive and happy, then moved out into the living room to sleep, because my mother and father could no longer sleep in the same bed due to her sickness. My dad took the room, and I took the living room. The first night, I was petrified. My brother slept on the other couch, but I was scared. I had a direct view into the kitchen where the basement was, and if I tried looking another way, I'd see into the bathroom. I thought, let's just look in the bathroom instead, but I was wrong. I saw figures going back and forth, and I ended up shutting the door like a coward. I wanted to take pictures to calm myself down, and happened to be using Snapchat. I didn't think anything of the pictures until people started messaging me, asking what the strange thing in the kitchen was, saying it looked like a demon. I felt scared and went to bed that night, only to be struck by sleep paralysis. I had sleep paralysis nonstop for a month. This is when things got really bad. I lay on my couch, stuck, unable to move, scream, or just look around frantically. This creature lifted me up, made me levitate, and opened my legs, tugging at the hem of my skinny jeans, which I used to wear to bed because I didn't have pajamas. Another spirit intervened and threw the creature down. I finally got out of sleep paralysis, fell, hit my head, and ran into my mother's room, scared and crying. Imagine being a 14 or 15-year-old asking to sleep with your parents because of sleep paralysis. After that night, I started to avoid sleeping as much as possible. But I eventually gave in one night and regretted it. I woke up to see my cat's bed being dragged away from me toward the basement. I had had enough. It could mess with me, but not my baby. I threatened to seal it away in the basement and attic if it didn't stop messing with my family and our cats. It's one thing to mess with me, but messing with my family and cats is something else. I told it I didn't want to seal it away, but that we could live in harmony together. Luckily, it stopped everything except for the shadow creatures, and occasionally hiding my shirt and throwing shavers at me. Ever since I moved out, my family has had very few problems with the entity. However, the shadow creatures won't leave my father alone. He recently told me he felt the same way about that room, and that if you ever opened your eyes, you could see a figure hovering over the bed. My brother leaves the bedroom door closed, so I'm sure he doesn't want to admit he's having issues with shadow creatures as well. Before I start second story, please like this video if you still haven't done it yet. Story 2. I've lived in the same home my grandfather built. My mom remodeled it while she was pregnant with me. It's in Southern California, in a slow and mellow beach community founded in the 50s, so there's not a lot of paranormal activity happening. The only peculiar thing growing up was the man who whistled outside my bedroom window every night at exactly 7:43 p.m. I never thought anything of it, and by the time I was in middle school, I basically used it to keep time. The whistle itself sounded like a man calling to a dog, short and happy. He whistled the same sound every night at the same time, even during daylight savings time. One night, my mom was in my room with me. It wasn't a common occurrence, as she had her own problems, and we didn't see each other often. I heard the whistle and promptly got up to brush my teeth and wash my face, as I did every night. My mom reacted kind of odd. In retrospect, I can understand why. She was in the middle of saying something, and I just walked out of the room. She followed me and asked why I was getting ready for bed so early. I just said I heard the whistle, and I wasn't going to sleep yet, but it was time for me to get ready. My mom has a terrible memory, but she says that's the one thing she can quote verbatim, besides the Pledge of Allegiance, because it was so unsettling. She hadn't heard any whistle, but didn't want to say anything. She listened at the exact same time the next night, but still heard nothing. However, she saw me walk to the bedroom and get ready for bed. She didn't tell me until I was 14, so I wouldn't be scared. Over time, I started to whistle with the man. I would imitate it perfectly and knew almost instinctively when to do it. It was like waking up to the same alarm time every day. I started doing this during my senior year, so I didn't really notice when the whistling got closer. I think it was because that was when I seriously started thinking about colleges. During my senior year, there was some family drama, and I had to move back in with my father for a few months. It seemed like something was missing, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't the whistling itself, but the feeling of being watched that always accompanied it. I'd gotten so used to it that I didn't realize how uneasy it really made me feel. After I turned 18, I moved back into the house alone. My mom got arrested, nothing crazy, and she was gone for 4 months. She wanted me to stay and watch the house, which put me off school. I spent most of my time either working or focusing on getting my GED. This was when things got weird. I never thought of the man as a bad spirit. I had almost come to see him as a guardian angel and made up a name for him, Gregory, and his dog was Socks. At some point, I realized just how sinister things were. Only I could hear the whistle. The number of sleepovers I had, where I was the one getting ready for bed too early, definitely proves that. It was only outside my window. If I were anywhere else in the house, I wouldn't hear it. It had slowly moved closer to the window over the years. I used to hear it on the street, but I realized it had crossed the grassy slope from the sidewalk to the brick foundation my house sat on. One night, after applying for college and getting in, I heard a tap. I had some thick blinds, so I swung them open quickly to spook whatever was trying to spook me. But I saw nothing. It was getting dark, and the sunset over the ocean was bright red, unusual, but nothing alarming. But what I saw in the sunset terrified me. There he was, his head cocked, just staring out from the outside wall beside my large front-to-ceiling window. It was only for a moment, almost like when something flashes on a screen for a tenth of a second. The face was pale, and his eyes were thin with age, but still intense. He had no facial hair, and his eyebrows were thick and wiry. When I blinked, I saw him like a brand on the back of my lids. I was shaken. The encounter felt like a warning. Why would the man who had been alongside me for so long try to hurt me? I almost felt betrayed. He had become the one constant. But now, when I look back on what I perceive to be a comforting caregiver, I am only met with an uneasy stomach and the beginnings of a headache. This was just the beginning. Every night he tapped on my window, and every night I jumped. I was still living alone and didn't want to call anyone about it. I felt crazy, absolutely batshit bonkers, and I knew it. I felt isolated and alone, unable to go anywhere but the place I feared most. My friends had either moved away for college or were staying with their parents, so I couldn't ask them for help. My family would lock me up. There's been a history of bipolar disorder in my family, and they shunned her for it. If I came forward about talking about a ghost man that I named Gregory and his dog at my window, they'd laugh. It seems funny from an outsider's perspective, really. I started taking the graveyard shift and doing night classes, which cost me more than they were worth. I stopped having friends over because, of course, they weren't going to hang out at my place where there was never anyone to bother our hooligan selves. I was so lonely for a long time, I started having panic attacks whenever I looked outside to see the sun setting. One night, it was so bad that my boss called after my concerned coworker contacted her and said that I needed to go home. It was the last thing I wanted, but this fear was making me physically sick. So I decided to grow some courage and stand in front of my open window exactly at 7:43. I stood there, chills running down my back, and waited. After moments of tense, staticky silence, I turned to look at the clock in confusion. It was 7:45. There was nothing, no whistling, no tapping, and definitely no face. I felt triumphant, almost cocky, as if I had conquered Gregory in socks. Just as I was coming down from my victory, I heard what sounded like long nails on my hardwood floor. It almost sounded like my dogs, but I had put them in the backyard to do their business, and neither of them were big enough to make that galloping sound. I couldn't see anything with my eyes, but I felt the fear of an animal running towards me at full speed, the hesitation between heartbeats. I had nowhere to run, but I knew I had to do something. I could feel the ominous, dreary presence of the man just outside the door, inside my hallway, and the threat of a feral dog in front of me, but I couldn't see it. For a moment, everything went quiet again, and I almost forgot how to breathe. I felt the presence leave. Then I heard it, clear as day, right in my ear. "I about you, Zoe." I could almost feel the breath rustle my hair. I broke down crying. I had never felt so helpless in my entire life. This thing that had watched me grow and go through puberty, breakups, and family drama knew everything about me. I had let this dead man dictate my life for so long, he had gotten into my head. I rented a shabby motel room for the next few weeks with my pups. I wouldn't recommend putting 2 dwarf pit bulls in a hotel room, but when I finally came back, the whistling was back on the street, accompanied by the sound of paws on concrete. This story terrifies me to my core. I'm in the city that I'll call home for a few more months to meet with my leasing agent, but right now I'm going home tomorrow, and I can feel that familiar sensation of what I can only describe as heartbreak and a loss of control seep back in. I don't want to go back. I found this place to share this story, and it felt like one of the few places I could ask for advice. I tried sage and even had my deeply Christian friend come over and say prayers at my doorway. I guess that's a thing. I don't know. Please, I need help. This isn't a lie, and it's not a story. I am terrified to go home to that empty house, but I'm saving for an apartment, travel expenses, and tuition, so I can't go to a motel. I really don't know what to do. Anything will be helpful. Gregory got so close to me, and I've heard that in order to hear something that clearly from the dead means that he is strong. Before I start a third story, please subscribe to this channel if you still haven't done it yet. Story 3. My boyfriend's grandfather is an antique collector, and one of his interests is dolls, porcelain to be exact. They picked this up, and the previous owners said to be very careful with it because it was special. Completely unfazed by this statement, he didn't ask any further questions and brought it home with him. The first few days were fine, and it stayed in the kitchen. Later, my boyfriend and I were laying in our room down the hall, talking, when suddenly 3 light knocks were heard through the door. We looked at each other, and from the other side, I heard his grandfather say his name. I got up and opened the door while he was getting ready for whatever task his grandfather had in store for him. Upon opening the door, I expected to be brought face to face with him, but no one was there. I closed the door and shrugged it off, but after I closed the door I could hear footsteps from down the hall. I went out to investigate, but in the distance I could hear both the grandparents snoring. The following day, all power to the house was lost and didn't return until a few hours later. Thankfully, throughout that night, 1 lamp was on. I don't know how, but occasionally it went out. For the most part, it was still being powered. A few more nights passed without anything happening until just a few nights ago. All through the night, there were screams. Not in the house, but right outside. One night, I was laying down watching videos when my boyfriend sat straight up, rambled gibberish mixed with numbers. I asked him what was wrong, and he said he was okay, looked me dead in the eyes, screamed, threw himself back, and continued snoring. I asked him about it later, and he had no memory of it. His grandfather is taking the doll to his shop, and hopefully things will go back to normal. After the doll was taken out of the house and put in his antique shop, the air seemed heavy, and everyone became easily irritated. Usually, the family is upbeat, with a we-can-conquer-anything kind of attitude. I've also had a few hyper-realistic dreams. One where I was drowning, another where I was burned alive, another where I was pulled apart, and one where I was captured and shown my new face, though I didn't have one. There was a tall man there who said, "Look at the beauty I have created." Unnerving, to say the least.